Hello, everyone, and welcome. We'll give it a moment to let people join in, and then we'll begin. Okay, I can see some people are joining. We'll just wait a couple more, maybe 1 minute more, and then we'll start. All right, let's start. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Anaïs Rios. I'm Senior Policy Officer at Seas at Risk, and I'll be moderating today's webinar together with my colleague Bavos Metz, who works on system change. This webinar, Retrofitting the Global Fleet with Wind Propulsion, is the third in our One Planet Shipping webinar series. This series explores different topics linked to the just and equitable transition and in shipping, and we will keep you posted on future webinar. Now, before we begin, just two quick housekeeping points. The first one is that the webinar is being recorded and we will make it available afterwards on the Seas at Risk website. And the second one is that you are all very much welcome to ask your questions, and you can submit them at any time through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll take the questions at the second half of the session. Now, let me briefly walk you through how the session will run. We'll start with a short framing from my side to set the context for the discussion. We'll then move to the presentation of the study that we are launching today by Dr. James Mason from the University of Manchester, who will walk us through the methodology and key findings of the global fleet analysis. After that, we'll hear from John Taokave, who will bring a perspective from Pacific Island states on what shipping transition means in practice, particularly in terms of equity and access. We will then move into a Q&A session, which will be led by my colleague Bavos Metz, before I come back at the end with a few short closing reflections. Just briefly to introduce our speakers, Dr. James Mason is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Manchester, specializing in low-carbon shipping and wind-assisted propulsion. His work focuses on identifying near-term solutions to reduce emissions, including through advanced modeling of ship performance and routing. John Taokave is a technical advisor to Pacific delegations at the International Maritime Organization. His work connects climate policy, cultural knowledge, and oceanic perspectives, including through his research on indigenous approaches to ocean governance and diplomacy. So with that, let me briefly set the scene. Today, most of the ships that will need to meet our 2030 climate goals are already at sea. They're operating within a system that remains heavily dependent on fuel. International shipping is expected to deliver emission reductions this decade in line with the IMO's decarbonisation strategy and broader climate goals. Much of the current discussion is focused on future fuels, but in practice, these fuels will take time to scale. They require infrastructure, investments, and their availability and cost remain uncertain. And we're already seeing how vulnerable the system can be. Recent tensions affecting key maritime routes, including the Strait of Hormuz, are a reminder that fuel supply chains are not only a climate issue, but also a question of stability, cost, and resilience, really. So the challenge is not only what fuels we will use in the future, but also how we reduce emissions and fuel dependence from the ships that are already at sea today. This is where wind propulsion becomes particularly relevant. Wind propulsion is not only an energy saving measure, it is a propulsion system in its own right. It reduces fuel use, but it also replaces part of the energy required to move a ship. And this distinction matters because when we talk about the transition, we often focus on switching fuels, but we pay much less attention to reducing the amount of the energy that the system needs in the first place. What the studies show is that wind propulsion can do both, can deliver reductions today and also reduce overall fuel demand across a large share of the fleet. And that has system-wide implication. Reducing fuel demand means reducing pressure on fuel supply, lowering exposure to cost volatility, and increasing resilience in a system that is increasingly exposed to geopolitical uncertainty. It also has implications for equity because when fuel demand remains high, pressure on supply and cost are not felt equally across the system, shaping who is able to access energy, invest, and participate in the transition. So the main question is not only what technologies we develop for the future, but how we use the solutions that already exist today to reduce the scale, cost, and vulnerability of the transition. This is exactly what the study we are launching today set out to assess. So with that, I'll now pass the floor to James to walk us through the analysis and findings. James, over to you.
Thanks, Anais. I've shared my screen. Hopefully you can see that. Is that all good?
Yes, all good.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Anais, and hi everyone. As Anais mentioned, my name is James Mason. I'm a research associate at the University of Manchester. And yeah, I'm very proud to say after some months of quite hard work, we've got some really interesting results to share with you today. That look at this question of scaling up wind propulsion across the entire maritime fleet. But before I get into that, I just want to share a little bit about my background and what actually makes me qualified to talk about some of the stuff that we'll be going through today. So I started working in this area in around 2017, where I did a PhD that looked at modeling wind propulsion with a complementary technology called weather routing. I spent 2 years working in industry, where I used the model that I developed in my PhD to estimate fuel savings for ship owners. And I'm now back at the University of Manchester, forever at university, where I am starting my second postdoc. So I've got around 10 years of experience modeling wind propulsion, and I've managed to bring a lot of that work together that I've done over the last 10 years to try and answer this very interesting but also quite difficult question of what fuel savings can wind propulsion offer the global maritime fleet. But first, and just to slightly repeat a little bit of what Anais said, why do we need to even answer this question in the first place? And this is something I've called the decarbonisation problem. So here's a very, very simple decarbonisation timeline from now to 2050 and beyond. And some new research from UCL and UMass had shown that new e-fuels might not become competitive at scale until the 2040s. That's if only weak policy interventions are applied. But obviously the sector need to cut their carbon, cut their CO2 before that, not just to meet the IMO's greenhouse gas reduction strategy targets, but also because of a process called cumulative emissions, which is simply the buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere over time. And because that CO2 stays in the atmosphere for thousands of years, it means that we can't wait to act, and the next decade is really critical. So that's the problem. The sector needs emission reductions today, but these new fuels aren't going to be available potentially until the 2040s. So the important question really becomes, what technology can fill this gap? And one potential option is wind propulsion. So you can see them in this picture here. These are advanced sails that are installed on ships, and they use the power of the wind to provide a direct propulsion force, which reduces the fuel consumption of the ship's main engine. And that's exactly what these Flettner rotors that you can see in this picture, these two big cylinders, are doing. They don't generate electricity, but they produce a physical force that's pushing the ship through the water to reduce the amount of fuel that it consumes. And these wind devices come in a few forms, but they're proven technologies. They're already commercially available. There's now around 100 that have been installed on large cargo ships around the world, with 100 more on the order book. So they're there and they exist today. And while these wind devices have been showing great potential, until now, there have been two main research gaps. First is that no one has assessed their potential across all of the ships that are suitable for installing wind in the global fleet, particularly using real operational data and advanced wind propulsion modeling. And because of that, which is the second research gap, no one's also calculated their decarbonisation potential when scaled up across this fleet out to 2050. So that's what our research has tackled in this project. So I've split it into two parts for this presentation. The first part, I'll talk about how we calculated those fuel savings on all the suitable ships in the global fleet. And then in the next part, in part two, I'll talk about how we modeled their uptake out to 2050. So we split the global fleet into the following 25 different ships that we defined as suitable for installing wind propulsion. You can see it covers a range of different ship types. You've got general cargo, bulk carrier, liquefied gas tankers, and others. And these collectively cover around 60% of global shipping emissions, which is about 70% of international shipping emissions. We then defined two rotor configurations for each ship. So the first is the baseline. So this is a lower number, and it's roughly similar to the number of units that are installed on today's vessels. And the second is ambitious, which is a higher number. And it may require new build vessels. It might need policy support to improve the financial case, for particularly when ships are installing more rotors. And this ranges anywhere between two rotors on a small general cargo ship, all the way up to around 8, even 10 on some of the larger bulk carriers, which is pretty ambitious, but what we've defined is still practically achievable. We then collaborated with Albatross Digital to model these ships, and we used their ship modeling platform to calculate wind propulsion for each of these ship types. They have a velocity prediction program which simulates the aerodynamics and the hydrodynamics of the ship, and includes some of the more complex forces, like things like added resistance in waves, hull side force, rudder forces, etc. They also have an advanced aerodynamic model, which calculated the performance of the Flettner rotors, and that included some of the more complex effects that some of the simpler models miss, things like interactions between different rotors. And all this modeling comes together to estimate fuel consumption for a ship, both with Flettner rotors and without Flettner rotors in different operational conditions. And what really sets this model apart is the level of detail that it's gone into. And getting this sort of data for these 25 ships really was a big task, both in terms of the amount of modeling effort and the amount of funding needed to obtain this data. And to make the simulations as accurate as possible, we've used real world data. We've used real world AIS data, which is operational data for global shipping for the full year of 2024. So you can see that data on the right here for general cargo ships. And for the 25 ships types that we defined, there were just over 34,000 ships with available AIS data. And when you combine together the total distance, it covered a total distance of 1.7 billion kilometers. So we physically simulated wind propulsion across 1.7 billion kilometers, which, just to try and convey how large that amount actually is, it's the same amount as modeling between Earth and Saturn. So it really is a huge amount of data, a huge amount of processing power, which we ended up having to run on a high performance computer and split it across hundreds of hours of simulations. And we brought all this together when we ran our simulations. So we have the AIS data, which you can see in the image on the left here. This is for one individual ship in 2024. At each of these points, at each of these AIS points, we got the historical wind, wave, and ocean current conditions that actually occurred at each point in time in 2024. We then combine that with the wind propulsion model, which I've already talked about, to estimate the fuel savings between each adjacent AIS point. And we did this for all ships, all 34,000 ships for the full year, to get the total estimate for the global fleet. So what did we find? Well, for the baseline case, which is the lower number of rotors, we calculated fuel savings of 6.3% on average across the 34,000 vessels. And for the ambitious case, this increased to 9.4%, which is within the range which is cited within literature. And what this translates to is more than 6 tons of fuel saved per day, every day for a year for the best performing ship types. But one of the most interesting things that we found is how those emissions are actually spread across the different ship types. So for people like me who like graphs, I put a graph of that in here. So you can see the cumulative share of ships on the x-axis and the cumulative share of fuel savings on the y-axis. But what this is practically showing is that it's a small proportion of ships that are providing the majority of the savings. And we found that it was about 16% of the ships in total in 2024 that would have provided 50% of the total emission savings. And that would be retrofitting only around 5,000 ships with wind. Which were these 5,000 ships? So we found that they're mainly bulk carriers and tankers, high utilization, they operate across good routes, they have good vessel speeds that are suitable for wind, and they also have a lot of deck space for multiple units to be installed. And this quite clearly shows the potential of a targeted adoption strategy where you prioritize installing these top performers first to deliver the most fuel savings and the fastest fuel savings. So the part one showed that there's around 6 to 9% available from installing all these suitable ships with wind propulsion, but we can't just install all of these ships today. So it's going to take time for the technology to scale up across the sector. And actually, it's the speed of this scale up which will dictate the amount of decarbonisation out to 2050. So this is what we looked at in the second part of this research. So in this uptake model, we had 3 main assumptions. First is that ships between 5 and 20 years old are eligible for retrofit. The second is that ships entering the fleet because of growth or scrappage are eligible for new build. And the third is that out of all the wind ships entering the fleet in any given year, they're split evenly between different ship types and whether they're new build or retrofit. So this is with no targeted deployment. And we looked at 3 different uptake scenarios. So the first is all-out wind, which is fast uptake. The second is accelerated adoption, which is moderate speed of uptake. And the third is business as usual, which is slow. And we define these 3 simply to cover a range of different uptake speeds. So it's not necessarily what we think will happen, but it's simply modeling them to understand what the contrasting results will be. And here's a graph of what those uptake scenarios look like. So you can see years on the x-axis from 2024 all the way to 2050, and the number of vessels on the y-axis. The black line is the total number of ships that are suitable for wind propulsion. So this is we used fleet data from Kepler to figure out the total number of ships in the fleet in 2024 that were suitable for wind out of all the 25 ship types that we defined. And that was roughly around 50,000 in 2024. And simply due to fleet growth, that increases or is assumed to increase up to 70,000 in 2050. And the other lines are our uptake scenarios. So you've got the blue, the orange, and the green. So the first case is all-out wind, and we've defined this as a strong coordinated policy incentives trigger a step change in deployment. Installations grow exponentially following an S-curve, peaking at around 5,000 ship installations per year. And this is essentially this blue line on the graph here. So we start at less than 100 installations, so that's around today's levels, and this increases all the way up to over 60,000 installations by 2050. Now, this is obviously a significant uptake, but remember that the majority of these emission savings are actually coming from a much smaller share of the total fleet. And this scenario actually found something that we weren't expecting and that we found was super interesting. So because in this model, we assumed that only ships between 5 and 20 years old are eligible for retrofit, when the scenario reached around 2037, all of the ships between 5 and 20 years old that are eligible to retrofit have been retrofit. So there's no more ships left to retrofit. So we ended up with this dotted line, which is the excess, which is essentially installations that can't physically be realized in practice. And what that means is that we're left with quite a significant number of ships in the fleet that are in fact suitable for wind, but they're too old to be retrofit. So they have to operate until the end of their life, until they can be replaced with new build wind ships. And so this is the first physical constraint that's been found if trying to achieve an uptake as fast as this. Our second scenario is accelerated adoption. So that's the orange line here. This is essentially wind propulsion uptake increasing at around half the pace of the all-out case. So you can see it's more gradual, and it reaches around 40,000 installations by 2050. And the final case, which is the green line, is this business as usual line. So we define that as installations continuing at around the same rates as today. So that's around 100 per year. And we use this as kind of sort of like a baseline scenario to compare the other two against. So what did we find from this uptake modeling? So here in the graph, you can see how the fuel savings change for all three scenarios out to 2050. And you can see how the fuel and CO2 savings are increasing because wind is scaling up in the fleet over time. So by 2050, the savings reach around 3.7% for the accelerated adoption scenario, and going up to 7.8% for the all-out scenario. And these savings are relative to the wind-suitable fleet, which by 2050 is around 70,000 ships. The annual well-to-wake CO2 equivalent emissions is around 50 million tons per year in 2050. And then across the full time frame, it leads to cumulative emission savings of over 750 million tons of CO2 equivalent, which is an arbitrarily big number. But then when put in context, it's about 170 million cars removed from the road for an entire year, or also the combined annual emissions of Thailand and the Philippines, which compared to this business as usual scenario, which is the green line, reaches only about 0.2% by 2050. The full potential of wind is likely higher than what we've modeled here for three key reasons. First, we model a plug and go scenario, what we've called a plug and go scenario. So this is essentially savings that are achievable with no changes to how the fleet currently operates. And this could be improved quite significantly by using other measures, things like weather routing, that has been shown to increase fuel savings quite substantially. We've also not modeled wind container ships, but these could be retrofitted with kites, and there's also some quite interesting emerging new build designs. And in the uptake model, we've also not modeled this targeted adoption, which we said was important from the part one. And really focusing on installing wind in top performers, the top 5 to 10,000 across the first 10 years would really help to achieve these savings faster. So to bring all this together, we've shown for the first time that wind propulsion can make a pretty meaningful contribution to decarbonising the global fleet. which you can see in the little meaningful summary that I've put there. The technology is commercially available today to cut fuel while waiting for e-fuels to scale. We've shown that crucially, these savings are concentrated around the top performers, so you don't necessarily need to install every ship to get the majority of the benefit for the fleet. But support from policy and regulation must ensure that uptake doesn't stagnate and follow this business as usual scenario, because this would leave quite significant cumulative emission savings on the table. So thank you, and I think we've got a presentation from John next, but I look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, James, for that presentation. This gives us such a clear picture of the scale and potential of wind propulsion across the fleet. Now, how this transition unfolds in practice also raises important questions around equity and access. And I'll now pass the floor to John for that perspective. Over to you, John.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Loud and clear? Awesome. First of all, just before I start, I wanted to thank Seas at Risk, my fellow panelist, Dr. James Mason, for having me share space with you guys and providing Oceania and Pacific perspective to our current discussion. Very, very, very much humbled and glad to share space with you all. Again, a warm greetings from Oceania. For everyone present, my name is John Taukave, and I share my story today in my role as providing technical support, cultural protocols with the Micronesian Centre for Sustainable Transport to Pacific delegations at the IMO, and as a passionate ocean advocate for our region. And before I continue, I just shared on the chat a basic summary in an article that was just released about the work that we're currently doing, and very much connected to this discussion. And so before I start, I want everyone to, if we could all take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. Awesome. Okay, guys, I begin my story with the ocean. For Oceania and the Pacific, the ocean is not about the distance, even though we voyaged vast distances. It's always been about connection. Connection to infrastructure, connection to food security, connection to culture, to our economies, to memory, and a connection to survival. For many developed countries, infrastructure usually takes the image of highways, railways, and canals, but for us, shipping is all of that combined and more. It's our lifeline. And so we rely on shipping for nearly all energy imports, most of our food, and most manufactured goods. Our routes stretch hundreds of miles between islands, our fleets are aging, and our economies are small. And so connectivity costs for us are among the highest in the world. And this is my starting point for any discussion on equity in shipping decarbonization. Because when we talk about transitioning to low carbon shipping, our Oceania states are transitioning from a system that is already fragile. And this includes underinvested fleets, limited maintenance capacity, and shipping services that often struggle to serve the most remote of communities. And so equity for us is about ensuring that decarbonization does not deepen these existing inequalities. It's about ensuring that the transition improves connectivity and not reduces it. It's about ensuring that climate ambition aligns with development realities, and this is where wind propulsion becomes incredibly important for us. So long before decarbonization became even a policy agenda, our peoples were already navigating sustainably using the wind. Wind propulsion is not a new thing for us. It's a living ancestral knowledge. It's our woven epistemology and a reciprocative relationship with the environment. And so today, modern wind assist technologies bring that knowledge into contemporary maritime systems. And more importantly, the research clearly shows this is not speculative, as my brother Jason had shared. Wind assist has already proven its value in our region, in our regional context. An example, during the 1980s oil crisis, our trials demonstrated around 30% fuel savings, and with modern materials and hybrid designs, saving over 50%, which is now achievable. This is why wind assist is widely identified as the most obvious first mover for Pacific shipping decarbonization. And it's not only a trend that's very appropriate for us, it's low tech, very adaptable and maintainable, scalable to smaller vessels, and very compatible with current hybrid systems. And this is what equity looks like in technology choices, most appropriate for our deployment. And now, allow me to highlight the Pacific Blue Shipping Partnership, which has become crucial for us at this point. This partnership recognizes that Pacific shipping cannot simply adapt technologies designed for large global fleets. Because our vessels are smaller, our routes are different, and our operational realities are unique. What works for a transatlantic container ship does not necessarily work for inter-island connectivity. Instead, the approach is to develop regional appropriate vessels, deploy demonstration fleets, and build operational experience across multiple countries in our region. And we're already seeing this in practice with the SV Juranai. The Juranai is a wind vessel that is a Pacific proof of concept demonstrating that wind-assisted hybrid vessels can operate in our conditions, creating space for local crews, local maintenance, and local knowledge integration. This bridges navigation knowledge with modern engineering. It's also important to recognize that our private shipping sector is thin and undercapitalized. Operators cannot take on the risk of investing in new technologies without real-world proof of concept. This is why demonstration fleets and pilot deployments are very critical to a just transition. And so equity here means de-risking innovation for those who cannot afford failure. It means building pathways that our countries can realistically follow, and it also means transitioning at our scale because technology alone is not enough. The research is very clear, and that's that a successful transition requires foundational investments in education, in training, maintenance infrastructure, maritime data systems, and strengthened institutional capacity. Without this, even the best technology will fail us. And so it's critical for the discussions, even at the IMO. And so as we move towards the intersessional working groups and MEPC in the coming weeks, starting next week, decisions are being made that will shape the entire decarbonization pathway, which includes fuel standards, economic measures, compliance mechanisms, and transition timelines. For us, Oceania, from an Oceania equity perspective, I wanted to highlight three things. First, pace. Our countries have consistently called for ambitious near-term measures aligned with 1.5 degrees, but delays in negotiations, additional studies, further impact assessments, and procedural deferrals continue to slow the transition. And for us, delay increases both climate risk and economic vulnerability. My second point, finance. The transition to wind-assisted and hybrid vessels requires upfront investment. Demonstration fleets, retrofits, training, and infrastructure all require funding. Without dedicated financial mechanisms, our countries risk being left behind in the transition. And this is why discussions around carbon levies, just and equitable distribution of mechanisms are so important. A just and equitable transition must be financed. And finally, voice. Our countries not only bring our vulnerability, we also bring solutions. Wind propulsion, hybrid systems, and regionally appropriate vessel designs are examples of Oceania-led thinking. These perspectives must be recognized within global negotiations as scalable pathways. And here lies the epistemic equity for us, which matters. We're not only the recipients of technology, we're also knowledge holders. Our ancestors sailed using the wind, the stars, the currents, and environmental understanding across vast ocean spaces. Today, wind propulsion reconnects that knowledge with modern decarbonization. This is the innovation grounded in relationship. So when we talk about a just and equitable transition in shipping decarbonization, we think beyond shipping emissions. We think about its connectivity, its affordability, the resilience of our communities, as well as our cultural continuities. Wind propulsion has offered us an opportunity to align with all of these. And so wind reduces fuel dependency, it lowers operating costs, it improves the energy security, it builds a regional capability and reconnects maritime system with ocean knowledge. And importantly, wind centers our reality. We have always and will always be a large ocean region with the wind behind our sails. And so I want to close where I began in my sharing, with the ocean. My connectivity with the ocean began with a ship that for 3 days traveled from the capital of Suva all the way to my island of Rutuma in Fiji. In 2019, this ship enabled me to connect to my own identity as a Rutuman, and I wrote a song on this ship. Nervous as the waves that struck the hull, and uncertain like the babies that were crying on board of what I was to expect upon arrival. At that moment, the chanted lullabies of our aunties and our grandmothers not only calmed their babies, but it also gave me some form of comfort that my own ancestors were there with me that night. I was so focused on my reconnection that I now realized, what if I were traveling on a wind-assisted vessel or a vessel that was retrofitted with wind propulsion? Would the outcome of this song be any different? Would it take a different course of my life as an advocate for sustainable shipping? I leave you with these reflections as I share this song called Fauhis. And in Rutuman, Fauhis means after how many years? Here we go. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, as the sun gets smaller beyond the horizon, sinking slowly to the ocean, birds fly back to where they belong as we sail through to the motherland. Fauhis atakwa mangoa so okya ot mota volu kafa malang raksa mangoho haa Kayoni kopua singo maro itokya salva stonti islasi. If I knew I could have stayed back in Fiji. As the waves come rushing in and the crews are running up and down, well, I know this would stop. And so I covered her up, kissed her goodnight, stood up to see. I can hear women chanting, well, I know this would be the only way we get to the islands. Yeah, 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 yeah. I can only hear yeah, 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 yeah. Overnight and through the storm, and finally the rain has stopped. I can see rainbows as clouds cleared out. The morning mist comes splashing to my face. I can feel the ocean vibe through my veins. Fauhis atakwa mangoa so okya ot mota volu kafa malang raksa mangoho haa Kayoni kopua singo maro itokya salva stante islas. If I knew I could have stayed back in Fiji. As the waves come rushing in and the crews are running up and down, well, I know this would stop. And so I covered her up, kissed her goodnight, stood up to see. I can hear women chanting, well, I know this would be the only way we get to the islands. Yeah, 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 yeah. I can only hear yeah, 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 yeah. Fauhis atakwa mangoa so okya ot mota volu kafa malang raksa mangoho haa Kayani kopua singo maro itokya salva stante islasin. If I knew I could have stayed back in Fiji. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, John, for those reflections, for bringing such an important perspective on this transition and how it's experienced in practice, and of course for this musical intro that is really your testimony. And now I guess I'll hand over to Bavo, who will guide us through the Q&A. Bavo, over to you.
Thank you, Anais. Thank you, Anais, and hello, everyone. I'm still a bit speechless, but thank you as well to James and John for your two very different, but if you ask me, very complementary presentations. I think they show well how the theme of wind propulsion is linked to many different other questions, right? It's retrofitting the global fleet with wind propulsion is of course a technical challenge. But it has indeed also an important human component. It raises crucial questions about equity and accessibility, and it has a strong link with culture and even with music. So that's really wonderful. Thank you so much. We will soon pass on to the Q&A part of this webinar. But before that, I would like you to answer a poll. We have a poll coming up with 3 questions. And if everything goes well, this shows up on your screen right now. We're going to answer this. You can answer these questions whenever you want during the Q&A. We'll give you some time, but we will come back to them at the end of the webinar. The first question is, what fuel savings do you think wind propulsion can deliver on average across all suitable ships? Is actually a quiz. Third as a quiz. The second is, what percentage of vessels do you think would deliver 50% of total savings over a year? Also was also mentioned, and then 3 is more as an open question. What do you think from your background, with your experience as well, is the biggest barrier to scaling up in propulsion today? So take your time for that. And also, if there's any other questions, I will see already many questions popping up in the Q&A. But please feel free to add to that. Voila. And I think in the meantime, I just let you write your question. In the meantime, I wanted to start off with a question for James. James, you worked incredibly hard and you produced a wonderful, comprehensive study. I read it through this morning. It's really a masterpiece. Thank you so much for that. I wanted to pick in on something you mentioned. So the results of the study, they show an average of 6 to 9% fuel savings, which is already very substantial. But you also mentioned that the study did not include certain things, operational factors such as weather routing. You've worked in your life a lot on weather routing, design optimization of vessels was not included in the study. And I was just wondering, of course, can you give us an idea of what happens when we start including them? How much more do you think is there to gain, or how sensitive are the results of the study now to these factors? And in that way, is this report a plea for including that kind of measures as well?
Yeah, good question. It definitely is a plea. I feel like if we were to get to the point where we've got a global fleet of these wind vessels sailing around, then it's a no-brainer to optimize the way that they perform. So using things like weather routing really can provide some really significant benefits. Just to give you sort of like a flavor of some of the work that I've done before. Like I said, my PhD was on looking at weather routing with these wind-assisted ships. And I found in my PhD that for a Panamax over the course of a year, on globally operated routes, the fuel savings increased by 60%. So quite a significant amount, so like 1.6 times. And yeah, this study didn't include that. It just included the AS data that we have, that we had available to us, which is how these ships were operating in 2024. And then if we start to include these things like weather routing, if we start to include things like hull optimization, so optimizing the way that the hull is to make the most of the fact that these ships have sails installed on them. Things like primary wind vessels weren't included as well. So this is assuming they're sort of like retrofit devices, but you have more and more of these emerging new designs that are primary wind ships. So that's where the wind is actually providing the majority of the power, and the engine is sort of like the assist in that case. So this study wasn't including that, and if we do throw these factors in, then it certainly will push that 6 to 9% even higher.
Very, very interesting. Thank you so much. And you talk about primary wind, which makes me which makes me think of a question for you, John, because it's very beautiful. You mentioned this whole cultural component and how wind power is actually anchored in a long history in the Pacific Island states. But when the visionary that I get when I think of all that is very different from the modern technologies that we're talking about. Wind assisted propulsion is quite high tech, and I was just wondering for you personally how much is this still linked to this to this cultural aspect? Because the systems we are talking about now, the study is talking about now, they really inscribe themselves in a global shipping system that is still based on productivity, that is seems very far to me from the reality or from the long history that lives in the Pacific Island stage. Is that still useful as a narrative then? Is it not too far away?
Hey, thanks, Bavo. I really do think personally that this wind assist technology and wind propulsion technologies very much can apply. It's just one is trying to recognize that the different regions and the different situations that exist for places like the Pacific Islands. And I think one there is a strong connection to the wind. There is a strong connection to culture with wind. And so trying to maximize on those technologies and applying them to our region at a good pace with financial support and holding that voice is really critical. And I think the example of the SV Jurani is a really good example. Not retrofitted, but it's an actual wind vessel that has shown a lot of progress and is a good example of the opportunities that our region has for maritime for shipping decarbonization, and getting that support from the political support from the PBSP, which is the Pacific Blue Shipping Partnership, adds on to that. And I think that the technology is out there, the opportunities are there. It's one recognizing the different regions and the situations that our regions face specific, and making sure that there is a fleet, there is a pathway, and that pathway is equitable and just.
Thank you so much. It gives hope, if I
Absolutely.
understand. I'm having a look at the Q&A. Feel free to put in more questions, but there are some already. Eloy has a question that I think I'm going to ask to you, James. To what extent do you think that wind-related energy savings, to what extent is there a risk that it could lead to just vessels having increased speed, but not the fuel savings? Just using wind power as a way to go faster rather than to save fuels. Is this something that policies should tackle?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So in this study, we do assume that any power that you get from the wind is it's for the same speed. So you get the power from the wind, the ship's still traveling the same speed, and you get that as fuel savings. Whereas one option is, shipping companies continue to operate at the same power, the ship at the same power. You add the wind on top, and yeah, that's not included in this. That is a risk to fuel savings from this in general. One interesting thing that a colleague is actually looking at for his PhD, which is a potential solution to this, is kind of like if you think about optimizing the system as a whole. So he's looking at how we can apply wind propulsion with optimized just-in-time arrival. So you get a fleet of ships that are using just-in-time arrival. They all slow down. They all keep their same, order queue. But these ships also have wind propulsion on. He's looking at optimizing that with weather routing as well, which is even more interesting. But then if you do that, then that forces these ships to slow down. You get the benefits from the slowing down in general, and you still get the benefits from wind propulsion. And actually, the percentage savings that you get from wind propulsion increases as you slow down as well. So you'd get an even bigger portion from wind. And I think when we're thinking about the decarbonisation problem, and especially looking towards climate change and the Paris Climate Agreement and the amount of CO2 cuts we need in the time that we have, I think we will need to use everything we can, all these sort of like all these different solutions that can combine together in this sort of like optimized system. And even just combining wind, weather routing, and just-in-time arrival in an optimized system could get you a significant way.
Yeah, great, thank you. Just maybe for the public, you mentioned just-in-time arrival. Could you just in one sentence explain us what it is?
Yeah, my colleague would do a better job, but so you've got all the ships that are arriving at a port, they all get a queue, and instead of sailing as fast as they can and then spending time waiting in the port, the ships will slow down so that they arrive exactly when they're needed. So they're essentially getting into the port at the same time, but they can spend the time actually slowing down and saving fuel.
Right. Thanks so much. John, for you, Gavin was inspired by the story about the Joranai. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, and he asks how have the passengers and crew experienced, because the human and social element is so important for this as well. Do you have anything to say on that? Any insight?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and man, shout out to brother Gavin. Thanks for being here and again putting me on the spot again. I mean, from what I can gather on the updates of the SV Juranai, it's a proof of concept prototype. There has been assessments that have been made that show how good or how applicable is a ship like the Juranai for a region or for a country like the Marshall Islands. I believe that there have been improvements in looking at passenger and crew education, training, and all. And I think that's sort of like starting to be incorporated into the PBSP. And so something like passenger and crew, their experiences aboard the Juranai, but getting them the training and the education and the exposure to, on how to maintain vessels, but also how to crew them as well, is really important. And I think there have been improvements in that, and we're slowly at that stage of looking at the Juranai as a prototype for more to get more fleets just like the Juranai, and to contribute to our decarbonizing fleet. I also saw a question from Sean. I hope that answers your question, Brother Gavin. I saw a question from Sean, and I really thought that was a great question. And so, how do we incentivize the shipping sector? And I think it must be familiar to some of you, or maybe to all of you, that the Pacific had led this initiative of introducing a carbon levy at the International Maritime Organization in the GHG negotiations. And the carbon levy, universal carbon levy, would incentivize the shipping sector, making sure that a transition is equitable, making sure that the revenues that are gathered from this levy as the economic mechanism would not leave developing states behind. And I think that was a key incentive, and that's sort of like become up into the current net zero framework that is still on the table, that we're going into discussions next week. So that's one example of incentivizing the shipping sector, was to make sure that there was an economic mechanism within international policy, and the levy was an example of what the Pacific had been leading in. Thanks.
Thanks so much, John. We have an anonymous attendee amongst us who is asking if there's a lot of additional infrastructure required for wind assist propulsion and whether it's available globally. James, I think you started your presentation by saying that the e-fuels require indeed big infrastructure to be successful, which is not there yet. How does it look like for wind propulsion, wind assisted propulsion?
Yeah, I mean, so it's an interesting one. I think one thing that I could talk about is what we touched on in the paper is the amount of capacity required by shipyards. So for the all-out wind case, we assumed a maximum of 5,000 installations in any 1 year. Now I actually think so with that all-out case, I think it ended up at about 60,000 vessels in 2050 that were installed. But then if we take the previous findings, where we're just looking at sort of like the top 50% of ships gets you 90% of the way there. So really, in that all-out case, if we were clever about it, you wouldn't need 60,000 ships. It would be much lower, 20 to 30,000 to get the majority of those savings. So in reality, it's probably not looking at you probably wouldn't need 5,000 installations in any 1 year. But that is a significant amount. But we did some very basic calculations, but found that would require it's around 200 shipyards operating at a capacity of one installation every 2 weeks to get 5,000 installations in a year. Like I said, it probably wouldn't be that number of shipyards that you would need to get this infrastructure installed on these ships. But yeah, so that was 200 shipyards. China alone has over 300 major shipyards. The EU has 150. So yeah, the capacity to install is potentially there. And from a manufacturing side, it's growing. I think the sector at the minute can have a capacity of, I think the numbers around 400 to 500 units in a year. So that's not what they're currently installing, but that's what the capacity is currently at. So yeah, new infrastructure is required. It's where they could theoretically provide more than the current numbers of installations. And it is growing, and the capacity is there to sort of like fill the fleet with these assumptions that we've made. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, very, very interesting, and I think it links a bit to Gavin's other question. What would you say, James, is the inflection point in terms of ship numbers to ensure vessels can optimize their activities? He's asking, and to make sure that this whole transition takes on speed and speeds up. Is there an inflection point? Can we?
Is there an inflection point where scale up? How do you mean? Sorry.
I think Gavin means that is there an inflection point that we need to reach numbers in terms of ships being retrofitted that we need for it to really be launched? I think we're now at the start. A lot has been done already, but what do we need in terms of numbers, or is that too hard to say to make sure this takes on the speed it should take and this grows?
Yeah, I think it's a hard question to answer, because I guess so. What this modeling is scenarios based. So we've essentially just said these are 3 different scenarios that might potentially happen, and we've sort of like defined those installation rates ourselves based on what we think is feasible from our expertise. So yeah, I guess it would be hard from that to draw on whether there's an inflection point. So yeah, I'm not I don't think this work could answer that, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Jumping back to John. John, I think you are working in very tough times. When we look at current political and geopolitical context, I'm wondering how hard it is today to bring in those perspectives that I think are unique and so crucial to the discussion on social justice, but also on sufficiency. I think you mentioned technology alone is not enough. These kind of narratives seem very contradictory to the current political climate. How hard is it to get this on the table today? And also, how do you stay positive in all of this, or do you stay positive at all?
Thanks for that.
Give us some hope.
Of course, there is always hope, and I think that's something that my experiences with in Oceania and with the Pacific that come to these negotiations at the IMO have always been inspiring, because one thing that we've always kept is the moral high ground, and that moral high ground has always been in line with the 1.5 that was agreed in Paris, but also staying true to what we agreed to at the 2023 strategy, and making sure that things like the net zero framework, which I must say the Pacific had compromised with, passes through, and we're always going to keep the moral high ground despite the current situation. Of course, the current geopolitical situation that's happening around the world is impacting us firsthand. We're at the forefront of both the geopolitical crisis, the climate crisis, and yet it feels like we're the only adults in the room contributing and participating in good faith within these discussions. And so I continue to look up to my mentors, people that like the late Tony de Broom, people like Ralph Riganvanu from Vanuatu, from the Marshall Islands leadership. Despite all of the challenges that we've constantly faced, we've always held the moral high ground. And I think that's something that we'll continue to hold, even though or even if we're left on our own. But that's something that I feel that that's a voice from the people back home. That's how they see it, and that's how they want our representatives that come to these places to make sure that we hold the moral high ground and we stay true to what we've always been saying, and to contribute in good faith, and to make sure that we actually live up to what we've always agreed to, and not delaying or pushing aside. And this is where the political thing comes in, because now negotiations have gone political, and so we are at this crossroads of trying our best to make sure that things go through, because we believe, and not like delaying or cutting everything out that would take years and years of hard work down the drain. And so again, in simple, we still have hope, we're still fighting, and we're going to continue on this journey.
Thank you. That's an important message. I'm looking at the Q&A box. I'm also looking at the time, and I'm aware we still we promised you to come back to the poll that was launched earlier. So I'm afraid this is just a topic that's too interesting and raises too many questions. Let's see if we can answer them by chat. I'm looking at my team, but I think we need to move on, and maybe when we are talking about the poll, we can come back on some of the aspects. Lou, I'm wondering if we can have the results of the poll, because that could be quite interesting. If all goes well, you now see the results of the poll on your screen. Most people think that fuel savings wind propulsion can deliver are moderate or major, so 6 to 10 or more than 10% of fuel savings. Most people think that the top 16 of the top 16 of the suitable ships that are installed with wind propulsion can deliver a percentage of 50% of total savings over a year. And what do you think? This is, as I was expecting, this is a bit distributed. What do you think is the biggest barrier to scaling up wind propulsion? And we see multiple answers, but no one answered technology readiness or availability. So it doesn't seem that the public thinks this is the major issue. James, I'm gonna let you come back on the first two questions. Did we listen? Did the public listen well to you, to your presentation? What are the answers to those questions?
I think I gave the answers away a bit too quickly in my presentation. Yes, perfect. Everyone was listening. Great work.
That's wonderful. So we have indeed 6 to 9%, but then we have peaks that go way above those 10% as well, the 10% fuel savings. Is that right?
So it's interesting to see that some people have said greater than 10%, because that's more than what we showed, which would be theoretically achievable if we started modeling the weather routing and things like that. So yeah, totally achievable. I mean, I find it interesting that no one for the third one has said technology readiness or availability, because that sort of like aligns with what I certainly hear a lot, particularly at the last conference I was at for wind propulsion. The barriers and challenges really aren't about the technology anymore. I mean, when I started here 10 years ago, it perhaps was more on the technological barriers side, but now 10 years later, that a lot of those have really been dealt with, and the barriers and challenges are no longer there. So it's nice to see that the poll reflects that.
And can I maybe twist the question a bit and ask it to you, James? What from your background and expertise, what do you think are the barriers today? Then what I think it links to a question from Ilko as well. Which factors and actors are frustrating the adoption of wind propulsion, if any? What do we need?
Yeah, for me, the biggest is regulation and policy, particularly around things like fuel price. So I think policy is definitely needed to strengthen the financial case for wind. So that's using all the different tools we have, like CII, strengthening the CII, the GFI, things like I hear people talk ship owners talk very positively about the Fuel EU and how much that can contribute to making a stronger financial case for wind. But when we're talking about things like bulk carriers, they spend a small amount of time. They don't spend all of their time in EU waters, or a lot of them don't. So that isn't, it's great, but if we had that across the world, it would be amazing. So yeah, things like stronger policy, stronger regulation. Also, one interesting point is finance models. So getting to the point where you're opening up more ships that are available to install the technology, both from supporting the installations, things like green financing and making the capex available for ship owners to be able to actually install them. But then also the fuel savings can be quite spread between the ships. So on average, you might get 6 to 9%, but for one ship, it might be 1%. For another ship, it might be 20%. And sort of like thinking about other ways in which that we can come up with some quite clever financing models that allows for that. Things like I know with just-in-time arrival, there's a company called Blue Visby that are looking at pooling their savings with everybody who signs up to it. So maybe you could do a similar thing for wind, where instead of just being 200, maybe 1,000 ships, and then you all get the average savings based on what the modeling is saying. So yeah, creative models like that. So yeah, regulation and financing models, I think, are two big ones.
And be but creative. Thank you. Thank you so much. John, what do you believe is the greatest barrier today? And do you align with the replies of the public, our participants?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and man, thanks to the public for answering the questions. And I think I'm in line with Jason. Is one of the biggest barriers is comes under uncertain policy frameworks or weak policy frameworks. And in my experiences with the IMO, we are currently at a stage like that where we experienced that at the extraordinary session last year at MEPC. And so things like that, or policies that continue to weaken or be delayed, is a red line for us.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, our time is up here together. I will just hand over the floor to Anaïs for some closing remarks. But thank you so much, John. Thank you so much. And thanks to the public as well. Yeah, we'll see you around. Thanks. Wait, James, are you there? Yeah. Anaïs, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Babo, and thanks to everyone for the discussion and the questions. To briefly close, I was listening to the conversation today, and I think we can highlight from this maybe three main points, which are that first, the solutions already exist and they can deliver reductions from the current fleet, reduction of emissions, from the current fleet. And then second, that reducing fuel demand is a critical part of the transition because it helps lower costs, ease pressure of the fuel supply, and it makes also the transition more manageable across all regions. And then the third highlight that I got from it is that, well, the effectiveness of these solutions, specifically wind propulsion, ultimately depends on policy designs. So as discussions continue at the IMO next week, this means that we need to be able to make sure that all of those frameworks are fully reflective of real emission reductions, so that ships investing in solutions see actual benefits from it. We need to make sure that those frameworks maintain strong incentives to reduce emissions rather than relying on compliance mechanisms, and that tools like the carbon intensity indicators are actually straightened, so that existing efficiency solutions are deployed in the short term. At the same time, it's really critical to ensure that revenues and opportunities from the transition are shared more broadly with and that will be key to support a fair and equitable outcome. So the question is no longer whether solutions exist, but whether policy will enable them to scale at pace and at the pace that is actually required. Thank you again to our speakers and to all of you for joining us today. You can find our study linked to that QR code.